started, and I've asked Sherry to open us in prayer.
Our dear Heavenly Father, thank you. Thank you, Father, for each morning. I thank you, Father, for your know and out of us what we need. I thank you.
All right. Well, Nate threatened to make me do a fourth Sunday school if I didn't leave time for Q&A. So I said, all right, we're going to cut stuff. And in the Q&A, you could ask more about junk DNA, hint, hint, because, thank you, Barbie has prepared a bunch of stuff, but very humbly is staying in the background. But anyway, she's got much more information about that. I do have some fun facts about what I call the artist formerly known as junk DNA. It's not junky at all, so that's pretty cool. The big three questions to review were, hey, how does something come from nothing? How does life come from non-life? How does complex life come from or not from simpler life? Now, and we haven't done those in order. We weaved around, but in the sermon was mostly the Big Bang and the fine-tuning of life, which is a great argument for design. 2 Sundays ago, we dived into evolution, and the big thing there is you have to have variety or change created in some way, and then you have to have environmental pressure to select out the fittest. You know, one of the arguments we won't talk about evolution is how it leads to such horrible human behavior. You know, basically a justification for might equal being right, and for the Holocaust, and for all sorts of atrocities, so including Planned Parenthood. So anyway, so but we've just stuck to the science. Can we believe the science? But the idea has had a very pernicious effect on the world. And we started to talk about mutation. Barbie did a great talk about that, and you know, the takeaway is mutations are 1,000,000 to 1 negative, and so evolution is already starting in the wrong direction. Selection is not powerful enough to overcome that incredible tide against it, where design would say, hey, it's been designed by God, but there's sin and flaws in the world. And that much more closely fits the actual science. And then last Sunday was more science versus evolution. And we talked about, you know, instead of gradual change, we see leaps in the fossil record. We see irreducible complexity where things don't have a lot of extra parts. They don't have wasted junk DNA. So that was the purpose. Junk DNA needed to exist. It was enthusiastically leapt upon by the materialists because a natural consequence of random artificial change bumbling its way through life, getting, you know, is that you're going to have a lot of leftover useless junk. But design, you're going to have, you know, a beautiful object like a Porsche or something where there's no extra clanking parts. It's a beautiful design, and of course that's what does show up more all the time. And then, you know, were the existence of similar working parts evidence for a descent from a common ancestor? And that's a hypothesis, and it has some merit to it. But we talked about Legos, and as it turns out, by the way, I'll just sort of jump ahead to this point. You know, with all these shared genes and so forth amongst living creatures, if you actually looked at what are so-called orphan genes, you can see that's also named from an evolutionary perspective. An orphan gene is a gene that only appears in one species. Well, if you had a library of all the genes of living creatures on Earth, the majority of genes would be orphan genes. The majority of genes would belong to a single species. By the way, as John calls it, the species gerrymandering that's done by some scientists is done to make their job easier. For instance, a wolf and a dog are officially different species, even though they can have young that can reproduce, which is a better definition of a species. Well, the advantage of that is they can show a branch on a tree. You know, hey, if this is this species became this species. It's like, well, they're the same species. You know, so the more species they are, the more evolution can claim to work. But even with their definition of species, which split up, you know, some siblings, a majority of genes belong to only one species. So that's much more an indication of design rather than, so it's like a Lego box. You know, if you've got your Lego tools, and you've got those sort of common bricks that are used everywhere, and but then you have a Swiss Family Robinson specialized piece, and you have a Tatooine Star Wars specialized piece. You know, so the majority of your Lego pieces are specialized for one scenario. So today we're going to talk about the origin of life. I've kind of kept it to the end because in some ways we've built up the vocabulary to understand it quicker, and it's also the weakest area of the materialists have. And then I wanted to tie it back into the Bible and the creation narrative, and then talk about how evolution isn't treated as a theory. It's treated as an axiom, as something you take for granted from the very beginning, and that has made it harder to understand. From that, you can understand why it still persisted this long, since there's no good evidence for it. And then have some Q&A. So hopefully you have some interesting questions, and if not, I'll throw more random facts at you. So, okay, so let's see. Maybe I have to turn this on. Looks like it's on. Okay, so this is a new slide to show an old idea. The old idea was from the sermon, from sort of the idea of design. And so there are 36, and scientists hypothesize maybe about 40. They believe there are some they haven't discovered yet of cosmological constants, like the gravitational constant, the strong electromagnetic force contract, the strong atomic force, things like that. So just looking at 2 of those 36 known, probably 40 of them, the strong nuclear force and the electromagnetic force. And this is on a log scale, so they increase by powers of 10. Then the shaded areas tell you what goes on in that region. Where we actually are is where that little X dot is. And where life could survive is in that red region, narrowly around that X. So too far one way, hydrogen can't form. Too far the other way, carbon can't form. Too far the other way, chemistry is impossible. Or stars cannot shine. So that's just looking at 2 of the parameters and saying, okay, you have to throw a dart, and it has to be within that red box. But by the way, your box is actually trimmed by every other parameter. So every other parameter that exists makes that size smaller. So just looking at 2 of them alone, that's where life, we have to be. And so by the time you're done, it's an impossibly small, 40-dimensional region that these things have to be coordinated in their values, or, life is absolutely impossible. So just a reminder, there's a lot of ways to look at it, but it's just a remarkable evidence for design. We talked about the tree of life. Seems pretty compelling at the beginning, but it assumes that literally all life forms came from one single, almost miracle accident. But the evidence we have, humans have only existed a little while out on the branches, and all we have any kind of scientific evidence for is like this forest of life concept, hypothesis. And that is actually the hypothesis in the Bible. It says, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds. So it's the idea of kinds, that there's a dog kind, There's a cow kind, the creatures that move along the ground, the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it uses that word many times. So where does the evidence, show up? Everything beyond the little branches is incredible amounts of speculation. Very weak science. In other words, the most powerful scientific method is if you do a double-blind study. Let's say you're trying to discern if a drug is any good for you or not. So you have doctors, and there's a placebo. There's an alternative hypothesis, something that has no compounds in it, but they physically look the same. The doctor handing it to you, they realize, has to not know, because he or she might behave differently if they knew they were giving you a sugar pill or if they were giving you something that could potentially really help you. So they're blind to the actual nature of what's happening. The patient is, of course, blind to the actual nature. And from that, and you split the two populations that get the drug or the placebo as evenly as possible, with the same distribution of age and sex and severity of illness and things like that. And they have it as large as possible. And from that, that is this, and you say ahead of time what your protocol is going to be. You don't adjust it as things are going on. That is the gold standard. And there's, apparently, I just learned this yesterday, across the world, throughout the last century or so, there's been an agreement amongst doctors that they would label their evidence according to strict criteria, where 6 is the highest level. That's the double-blind study. And you know what the lowest level is? Expert opinion. So, actually, there's some research recently that shows that experts at hard things, experts are no more accurate than the population in general, but much more confident. So expert opinion may be even negative in its value, but basically everything in the evolutionary theory is at that lowest level of evidence. Lots of speculation and hypotheses from experts rather than any kind of repeatable experiment that has measurable results and so forth. By the way, I can't help but tell this story. We helped discover a drug back in the day that wouldn't exist without us, and because of data science, yay. But I learned a lot about placebos. Placebos are astonishing. In fact, a lot of drugs that were past muster 15 years ago wouldn't pass muster today. And part of the reason is the power of the placebo is so strong. If you took a placebo, a sugar pill, and compared that to taking nothing, virtually everything would show a significant result. And the question is whether people have measured actual biochemical changes in a person's body from taking a placebo, even because of the power of the mental suggestion in some way overrides what else is going on. And the whole double-blind study thing started to break down during the era of social media, because a lot of times the compounds have side effects. So people would be in a double-blind study, they would find people like them, and they would be complaining about the side effect. They're like, oh, I must not have the real drug, and they would quit the study. So very cleverly, they now put side effects in the placebo. And so the placebos are even more powerful than ever before, because you feel sick when you get them, or your pee is blue, or whatever the side effect is of the real thing they put into the placebo. So anyway, side note, but God has done something and created something in us that's pretty powerful, that makes medical science even harder than it would otherwise. But okay, so then I didn't really talk about the fossil record, but I wanted to throw in some quotes from, proponents of evolution to show how serious the issue is. By the way, I can send these slides to anybody that wants copies, and they're also being recorded on video, and for if you want to look at it carefully. I just have a little cartoon picture of the fossil record there. But from Charles Darwin, he's saying, there must be intermediate varieties which have formerly existed. The number must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate leaks? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory, his theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection in the geological record. So there was huge confidence that as we learned more and dug up more, we would start to fill in these gaps. And yet I don't know if you all have read articles, this new dinosaur has been found, never suspected before. In other words, like the complexity keeps getting greater instead of, oh, this dinosaur fits in at position 3.5 between dinosaur 3 and dinosaur 4. So that was in 1859. Now, almost 120 years later, Stephen Jay Gould, who's invented the term punctuated equilibrium, says the absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediaries in many cases, to even imagine intermediate versions that would work, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. So this is one of the foremost evolutionists saying, 100 years later, the problem is still there. This is a huge, huge weakness. Now, he invented something called punctuated equilibrium, which is just a description of what the fossil record looks like. Equilibrium, no change for a long time, boom, sudden change. He's not explaining how that happened. He's just describing it. And that's not a solution. The whole question is, how does that happen? Why is it static for so long and then a sudden humongous change? Because that's all the fossil record shows. By the way, I just learned this morning, the punctuated equilibrium, they take these jumps or in the record, and the gradualists kind of creep along slowly. So they're known as the jerk evolutionists versus the creep evolutionists. So just had to share that. Okay, so the two theories. Jumping now to origin of life, somewhat new topic for us. So setting it up, Darwin originally in a letter so he published The Origin of Species in 1959. So 7 years later, he wrote, though I expect it, and he didn't address the origin of life at all. That was a problem beyond his ability, he thought. So, and even 7 years later, he said, although I expect at some future time, the principle of life will be rendered intelligible. At present, it seems to me beyond the confines of science. But then in a letter to a collaborator 5 years after that, he started to hypothesize. But if, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. And part of this was driven by a discovery by a chemist that urea, something that the body naturally produces, could be synthesized. It could be built from just a chemical reaction in a lab. And that was the first time anything related to a life form could be chemically reproduced. And so, as is their wont, there's a small step and they extrapolate. Like, okay, we can do this one thing. Well, maybe we can do all the things. We can make life from non-life. And that was actually the confident feeling of most of these types of scientists. So they're thinking of this primordial pond where, things would, there'd be this soup of ingredients, and then with, a zap of electricity or underground volcanoes or something would trigger a change. So this was actually physically attempted in one of the most famous experiments of all. Many of you may have heard about the Miller-Urey experiment, where a bunch of gases were heated up and water was, evaporated, and it had a little trap at the bottom to collect anything that formed. And they put in, I don't know the chemistry enough to know what those symbols are, but several, ammonia and water and stuff together. And Miller was a grad student. Urey was a professor, a Nobel Prize-winning professor, and in a week, they had some reddish junk down in the trap that they discovered had some amino acids in it. So they had put some of the chemistry had reacted and given something that had a small role in life forms, a slightly more complex chemical reaction. And from this, the extrapolation is life, just stuff like this one little step. Okay, many of these steps like this, and we'll have life. And there are detailed critiques of this that are very devastating. By the way, this is basically in the subsequent almost 70 years, this is basically where they still are. Let's change the gases a little bit. Let's make because they still can get, step one of a possible million steps that's needed for life. So this particular experiment, the conditions actually were very different from those of the Earth atmosphere, and it was a lab conditioned with purified things, and it was under a very specialized setup. So that's one critique. But the main critique is that the beginning was set up wrong. At the end, the result was very trivial, and that remains to be the case. There's some great. I can point you to some great and detailed resources on 4 major types of biological components that are needed to even have the building blocks for life, and how complex they are and how far away they are from step one. So but let me just quote some people. So in Scientific American, 20 years ago, sudden appearance of a large self-copying molecule such as RNA was exceedingly improbable. The probability is so vanishingly small that it's happening even once anywhere in the visible universe would count as a piece of exceptional good luck. And this Harvard chemist George Whiteside won the Priestley Medal, the highest chemistry award, and during his acceptance speech, he was talking about the origin of life. This problem is one of the big ones in science. It begins to place life in us and the universe. Most chemists believe, as do I, that life emerged spontaneously from mixtures of molecules in the prebiotic Earth. How? I have no idea. And this is really the most honest phrase for basically everything we've talked about in evolution. I'm absolutely sure it happened. I have no idea how. But do they show that face to the public? They confidently teach us and our kids, this is a fact. And they use, extrapolations from very small steps in the right direction in a way that's accepted nowhere else in any other branch of science. There's some great videos and quotes on that, but we will just have to believe me for now. Okay. And it reminds me of those great instruction manuals of how to draw a horse. Okay? You start off, these are the steps, just follow these steps, and you'll inevitably get this beautiful horse picture. You draw the circles, add legs, the face, the hair, and with just a few more fine-tuning, you get a horse. So, so this is my summation of the whole origin of life studies. Basically, in fact, this goes farther than the origin of life because we get to the hair, So anyway, it's kind of laughable when you look at it as a non-believer in that hypothesis. Why? Why does evolution get treated as a fact rather than a theory subject to evidence or verification or whatever? Well, Bill Basner had these slides that he allowed me to borrow, where you look at the leading textbook on evolutionary biology, and the first sentence is, all biological sciences rest on 2 central principles. One is that all life processes have an entirely physical and chemical, i.e. material basis. And 2 is that all organisms and their characteristics are products of evolution. So if you take it as a fact and build from there, then it all works. So basically all biological papers and everything have to explain and use the vocabulary of evolution to talk about their findings, whether you believe in evolution or not, or it won't get published. Because nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution, according to them. So if you're going to guard the gate and keep any other idea out, you can keep it going. I want to play a 4-minute clip from, and if we can get that like in full screen mode on the far right, and hit play, and I'll let this scientist talk.
What actually happened was I was in my college, we had a nice dinner one night, and I found myself sitting beside a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. And I chatted to him, and in those days I was happy to talk to anybody because I found asking questions much easier than answering them, and I played Socrates. So at one stage of the conversation, we were getting on fine, I said, look, in your work that won you the Nobel Prize, did you ever think that there might be a mind behind the universe? And he got red, he got angry. No. And it was disingenuous, And that was the end of it. He turned to the neighbor, as one does at these dinners, and I thought, that's it, I've blown it. But at the end of the meal, he said, Lennox, come to my room. And it wasn't an invitation, it was a command. So I went to his room. And to my great surprise, he invited senior members of the university, 3 or 4 of them, plus the chaplain of the college. And as I remember, they put me in a chair, they stood mine. And he addressed me and he said, look, do you want a career in science? I said, yes, I do, really. I like one. Well, he said, if you want a career in science, in public, in front of these witnesses, you deny your naive faith in God. Because I tell you something, if you carry on with this, you will be intellectually crippled, you'll never make it, you'll suffer by comparison with your peers. So here and now, give it up in public. Talk about
famous mathematician and philosopher, and he's got some delightful things to say. He was talking there to James Tour, a professor at Rice. Currently, I didn't overlap with him while Elizabeth and I were at Rice, but my chemistry professor, I probably mentioned this story, was a colleague of his, was an atheist, but became a Christian through James Tour's influence as a colleague. Excellent. He's got hundreds of publications, several books, hundreds of patents, started several companies. He's really a genius, and probably the only reason he doesn't yet have a Nobel. By the way, my chemistry professor did win a Nobel Prize, and this fellow, James Tour, pretty much everyone says should have had a Nobel by now, but he is a Jewish person who became a very faithful Christian. And in all of his podcasts and everything, he says, if you do not yet believe in the resurrection of Christ, call me up. And it's like, don't call if you're a believer already. I don't have time for that. But if you're not a believer, call me up and he'll talk to you. So just an amazing guy. I've corresponded with him, but we haven't met in person. So I look forward to doing that sometime. So he has a channel and he interviews folks. And he is perhaps the leading expert on how the origin of life studies are flawed. He kind of got into that fight and really took it on. So if you have any interest in that subject, I can point you to some great resources. Okay, so I want to end with, in the prepared time, and leave a little time for questions. This is Genesis, the first 26 verses of the Bible, and it talks about these days of creation. And Hugh Ross, who started Reasons to Believe, which is an organization with tremendous resources, at Old Earth Creation, he became a believer reading the Bible. He had deep knowledge of science, but no real knowledge of Christianity. He read this passage and became a believer, basically, because it echoed what he knew about science from a narrative thousands and thousands of years old. And so I'll just point to the framework that he pointed out is the days of creation, of light, sky, land and vegetation, sun, moon and stars, fish and birds, land animals, and then humans, is the order that current science folks think things happen. Now there's a little confusion about, well, wait, sun and moon and stars appear in the middle of the list. What's going on there? Well, Hugh Ross immediately recognized that this is the order you would perceive if you were a viewer on the surface of the earth. So if you think about how revelations are done, it's probably done very visually. That's our most efficient mode of learning things. So God is giving visions to Moses or to Paul or to Elijah, or, people are seeing things and they're then having to describe them. If you were on the surface of the earth and watching a time-lapsed, video of what was going on, you would see this dull light in a very cloudy atmosphere originally. And then only later would there be a sky that's sort of interpreted as a complex, stable water cycle of the water, raining and then evaporating and so forth. Then land actually appears. It was actually an event, a relatively short event, where the earth goes from like 2% land to 27% land as the waters recede, and then vegetation, there's enough light for vegetation to occur. There's a great oxygenation event. That's where a lot of oxygen entered the atmosphere or was created due to that vegetation. And then the sky becomes transparent enough to distinguish the sun and the moon and stars occasionally. And then the order of fish and birds, and then later land animals, and kind of very late in the day, humans. And this can be interpreted as 6 literal 24-hour days, with a lot of apparent age being thrown in as a backstory. Yeah, but it also is great to see that even if you believe the Earth is 4 billion years old, 4.5 billion years old, and that's what BYA, a billion years ago, and then million years ago, and then thousands years ago, K is for thousands, where these ranges are, that the order is right, that a vision of what the earth was like from our perspective right now would have revealed things in this order. So that's pretty exciting. And then, so humans are estimated by this to have probably appeared 130 to 15,000 years ago. And where those numbers and ranges come from is that since the four rivers converge in the biblical story in the Garden of Eden, it had to have been at the tail end of an ice age. And so there's a one ice age peak 130,000 years ago. There's another one about 250,000 years ago that's a possible origin time. So that range is pretty small for humans, and seems to fit also with what little we know in the fossil record. One thing about the fossil record is apparently if you looked at all the fossils that purportedly belong to a different individual before 10,000 years ago, there's about 6,000 individuals. So it seems like a pretty large record. But if you go back further than that, all of the bones from all of the known humanoid type critters would fit on one picnic table. So we don't, sometimes people have a molar, and that's Homo habilis or whatever. I don't know that exact assignment, but sometimes there's a very, very small sample that's assigned to, and there's a lot of fluidity in what the proposed relationships are between these findings. But so there's not a lot of evidence going back more than 10,000 years, or especially more than 20,000 years, and a lot of that is very, very speculative. So, but anyway, I wanted to end on. I've been spending weeks tearing things down, so I want to end on a little bit of something, building up the alternative hypothesis. All right, we ended there. We have a few minutes for questions, and not as many as I'd hoped. I'm sorry, but.
For the biblical account of years, based on the genealogy in the Bible, Adam and Eve only goes back 6,000 years.
Yes, and so that's some people say, well, they're only highlighting some of the genealogy. Certainly that could be the answer, and God could have created all of what he created in any short amount of time necessary. He exists outside of time. So that's a possibility. What old earth creationists would say is that man was created very, very late in there, injected in, and there's an interesting structure in the days of creation. There's a night and a day, a night and a morning, and one day. And that is mentioned for the first 6 days, but not for the seventh. And the seventh is still open. So it suggests that maybe all the days were long periods of time, just like the seventh day. Very interestingly, the fossil record shows pretty continuous introduction of new species and extinction of old species. And there's events, huge, horrible events that destroyed a lot of life, but never completely. But it shows there is no new species since man. Like when God created man, his days of mankind, his days of creating were done. And that's actually, there are a few trivial species, but they can be explained as just mild modifications of existing species. So they're not actual new species. So that's kind of interesting. It does fit in with the creation record of their, having him resting from the act of creating. Silas, you have a question? The dinosaurs would be the animals, the land and sea animals appearing, within that range of time. And, what is the purpose of all this going on? That's a whole nother interesting discussion. But the hypothesis is, I don't know if you've seen this, is it Sunoco that has the little dinosaur emblem on their gas stations? Anyway, the hypothesis is that, Sinclair, thank you. All of the stages of life were to terraform the earth for us. So the oxygen being created, and then all the different chemical reactions, and then the storing of huge amounts of carbon in the ground in the form of gas and oil and things like that that would make modern life possible. So why would that be necessary? Because we had to develop the scientific capability to read the heavens. So, you know, it's kind of a remarkable story that puts us at the center of the whole universe back again. You know, whether we want to or not, it looks like God created the entire universe for our benefit, and he has a plan about however many souls will be reached before this whole experience is over. So it's a very interesting, compelling alternative. You know, to the evolutionists, we humans are a stain on the earth. We are cockroaches destroying things. It's a, you know, it's a horrifying alternative, really. I just have to say a couple things about junk DNA. Okay, so you may have heard the estimate that, okay, chimps are a lot like us. We have 98.5% as the same DNA. And I've seen estimates from 96. Pfizer has a website where they say 96. But anyway, hugely like us. And they look like us. They're our nearest cousins, right? The evolutionary theory is we descended in separate directions. Not that we came from them, but we both came from a common ancestor. We're kind of the savanna apes, and they're the tree apes. They kind of won out and got the trees, and we had to go, you know, second place and get the grasslands, which are less protective. But that's looking at the 2% of the DNA that creates proteins. The other 98%, formerly known as junk DNA, is extremely different. And the mental capacity of humans is far greater than that of chimps. And even in the evolutionary theory, when you have cousins that branch off, they have equivalent mental capacity. So that's a knock against their theory once again. But the whole key, if you ever hear that 98.5% number, they're looking at that 2%. By the way, we are 60% like a chicken, looking at that 2%, and a slightly closer, 61% or so, to a banana. So, you know, that's fluid because they're just now learning more and more about the what's it actually called now instead of junk DNA? Non-coding DNA. So how you measure, like I'm saying, you know, if you look at just the structural DNA, we're 60% close to a banana. So that's not a very effective measure. So, it's hard to put a number on, but as they get smarter about which ones to pay attention to, then we can get a number. One thing that's astonishing in this is that you see stuff that's been debunked for decades still being presented. It's like we can't talk about this because the public is not going to understand, so we're just going to keep telling them this. Because we know evolution is true, so we're just going to keep using our old arguments, even though that particular argument has been debunked, just so we don't confuse them. So it's really, it makes you angry, actually. Now they are. So the question is, are they spending? They weren't for years because of its label of being junk. So it actually held back science for a long time. You know, the Christian worldview that everything's there, that's designed, and so it's got to have a purpose. Let's figure out what that is. That's been fantastic for science. So this was an anti-Christian worldview. That's junk. Don't even waste your time looking at it. But now somebody eventually, you know, people run out of things to look at, so somebody looks at it. And Barbie has something too.
There's a whole field of looking at the DNA formerly known as junk, and it's called epigenetics. And what they're finding is that there are sections of this non-coding DNA that influence the coding DNA. And it enables certain genes to be turned on or turned off. Because if you think about it, every cell has the full DNA blueprint, but some cells become liver cells, and some become skin cells, and some become nerve cells. And that happens through the influence of epigenetics. They turn on and turn off genes. So your liver doesn't care about the gene that determines eye color. And so that whole section of the DNA genome that they don't yet know what it does, they're beginning to study how that part of the DNA influences the structural DNA. So that's epigenetics.
And that's relatively recent. And so, but you can imagine how important that is, because that has even more information content in it than having just the building blocks. So you now have the instructions. And so that's a huge argument against evolution in the first place, is this massive amounts of information. And any type of information is there, an author of that is there. All right, I think we've run out of time, but thank you all